The Stono Rebellion. The Stono Rebellion is a slave uprising that occurred in South Carolina on September 9, 1739. It began when a group of approximately 20 enslaved Africans, many from the Kingdom of Congo, gathered near the Stono River. The rebels broke into a store, seized weapons and ammunition, and killed the storekeepers. They then began marching south toward Spanish Florida, where Spain had promised freedom to enslaved people who escaped British colonies. Along their route, the rebels burned plantations, killed between 20 and 25 white colonists, and recruited additional enslaved people to join their cause. Their numbers grew to nearly 100 participants. The rebellion was suppressed when a militia caught up with the group later that day. A battle ensued, resulting in the deaths of approximately 40 enslaved people and 20 white colonists. Survivors scattered, with some evading capture for weeks or months. The Stono Rebellion represents the largest slave uprising in the British mainland colonies before the American Revolution. It led to the implementation of the Negro Act of 1740, which severely restricted the movement, assembly, and education of enslaved people throughout South Carolina, and influenced slave codes across other Southern colonies. The New York Conspiracy. The New York Conspiracy is an alleged plot that occurred in New York City during the winter and spring of 1741. It involved accusations that enslaved Africans and poor whites conspired to burn down the city and murder its white inhabitants. The panic began when a series of fires broke out across Manhattan, including blazes at Fort George, the governor's house, and several other prominent buildings. Authorities arrested Mary Burton, a white indentured servant, who testified that she had overheard plans for an uprising at John Hewson's Tavern, a known meeting place for enslaved people and lower-class whites. Her testimony, along with confessions extracted under duress and torture, implicated over 150 enslaved Africans and 20 white people. The trials that followed resulted in 34 people being executed, including 13 burned at the stake, 17 hanged, and 4 white people hanged. 70 enslaved people were sold and transported to the Caribbean. Modern historians debate whether an actual conspiracy existed or if the episode represents mass hysteria fueled by racial fears, economic tensions, and paranoia, similar to the Salem witch trials. The questionable nature of the evidence and coerced confessions suggest judicial overreach rather than legitimate criminal proceedings. Tacky's War. Tacky's War is a major slave rebellion that erupted in Jamaica on Easter Monday, April 7, 1760. It was led by Tacky, an enslaved man who had been a chief in West Africa before his capture. Tacky and his followers, primarily Coromantee warriors from the Gold Coast of Africa, launched a coordinated attack on multiple plantations in the parish of St. Mary. The rebels killed plantation overseers, seized weapons and gunpowder from a fort, and recruited additional enslaved people to their cause. Their goal was to establish an independent African state in Jamaica. The uprising spread rapidly across the island, involving thousands of enslaved people and lasting over a year. British forces, assisted by Maroons, indigenous freedom fighters who had previously established their own independent communities, eventually suppressed the rebellion. Tacky was killed by a Maroon marksman, and his head was displayed on a pole as a warning. The rebellion resulted in the deaths of approximately 60 white people and between 300 and 400 enslaved rebels. Tacky's War forced the British to fundamentally reconsider their colonial security policies throughout the Caribbean, leading to increased military presence and stricter controls over enslaved populations. The Baptist War. The Baptist War is a massive slave rebellion that occurred in Jamaica from December 1831 to January 1832. It was led by Samuel Sharp, an enslaved Baptist deacon and preacher who organized what was initially planned as a peaceful labor strike during the Christmas holiday. Sharp convinced enslaved people across western Jamaica to refuse to work until they received wages and better treatment. He strategically chose the Christmas period because planters needed their cooperation during the busy harvest season. The passive resistance quickly transformed into armed rebellion when some plantation owners attempted to force enslaved people back to work through violence. The uprising spread rapidly, involving approximately 60,000 enslaved people across multiple parishes. Rebels burned over 100 plantations, causing damage estimated at over £1 million. British military forces and militia brutally suppressed the rebellion, killing between 300 and 500 enslaved people during the fighting and executing hundreds more afterward, including Samuel Sharp, who was hanged in May 1832. Despite its violent suppression, the Baptist War demonstrated the economic unsustainability of slavery and the determination of enslaved people to resist. It significantly influenced public opinion in Britain and accelerated the passage of the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. The German Coast Uprising. The German Coast Uprising is the largest slave rebellion in United States history. It occurred in January 1811 along the German coast of the Louisiana Territory, an area northwest of New Orleans inhabited by German immigrant farmers. The rebellion began on January 8th at the plantation of Manuel Andre, where between 200 and 500 enslaved people organized under the leadership of Charles Deslandes, a mixed-race slave driver from Saint-Domingue. The rebels adopted military-style organization, forming columns with drums and banners as they marched toward New Orleans. They burned plantations, killed 2 white men, and recruited additional enslaved people along their route. Their numbers grew as they advanced, creating panic among white residents who fled to New Orleans. Territoria. White Governor William Claiborne mobilized militia units and federal troops to intercept the rebels. 2 battles ensued, first at Jacques Fortier's plantation, and then at Bernard Bernoudy's plantation, where the rebellion was crushed. Approximately 95 enslaved people were killed in battle or executed afterward, with their heads displayed on poles along the river road as a warning. The German Coast Uprising has been systematically suppressed from mainstream American historical narratives, with many textbooks omitting it entirely despite its scale and significance. Nat Turner's Rebellion. Nat Turner's Rebellion is a violent slave insurrection that occurred in Southampton County, Virginia, in August 1831. It was led by Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher who believed he had been chosen by God to lead his people out of bondage. Turner interpreted a solar eclipse in February 1831 as a divine sign to begin preparations. On August 21st, Turner and approximately 70 followers initiated their revolt, moving from plantation to plantation, killing white residents regardless of age. The rebellion resulted in the deaths of approximately 60 white people, including women and children, making it one of the bloodiest slave uprisings in American history. The insurrection lasted only 2 days before militia forces and armed white citizens suppressed it. Turner evaded capture for 2 months, hiding in the woods near his home plantation before being discovered, tried, and hanged on November 11, 1831. The rebellion triggered widespread panic across the South, leading to the murder of over 200 enslaved people by white mobs who feared further uprisings. State legislatures throughout the South responded by enacting harsh laws prohibiting the education of enslaved people, restricting their movement and assembly, and intensifying surveillance. Nat Turner's rebellion intensified the national debate over slavery and hardened positions on both sides. The Amistad Rebellion. The Amistad Rebellion is a slave revolt that occurred aboard the Spanish ship La Amistad in July 1839. It involved 53 Africans who had been illegally kidnapped from Sierra Leone and sold into slavery in violation of international treaties prohibiting the Atlantic slave trade. The Africans, led by Sengbe Pi, known as Joseph Cinque, seized control of the ship while being transported from Havana to Puerto Principe, Cuba. They killed the captain and cook, ordering the remaining crew to sail back to Africa. The Spanish navigators deceived them by sailing north instead, and the ship was eventually intercepted by the U.S. Navy near Long Island, New York. The Africans were imprisoned in Connecticut while authorities debated their legal status. The case became an international incident involving Spanish diplomatic protests, American property law debates, and abolitionist advocacy. Former President John Quincy Adams argued their case before the Supreme Court, contending they had been kidnapped and had the natural right to fight for their freedom. In 1841, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Africans, declaring them free individuals who had been illegally enslaved. 35 survivors returned to Sierra Leone in 1842. The Amistad case challenged the legal foundations of the slave trade and energized the abolitionist movement. The Creole case. The Creole case is a successful slave rebellion that occurred aboard the American brig Creole in November 1841. The ship was transporting 135 enslaved people from Virginia to New Orleans for sale, when 19 enslaved men, led by Madison Washington, revolted on the night of November 7th. The rebels killed one white crew member and injured several others before gaining control of the vessel. They ordered the crew to sail to the British Bahamas, where slavery had been abolished. When the Creole reached Nassau on November 9th, British authorities initially detained the rebels involved in the killing, but allowed the remaining enslaved people to come ashore. Local Bahamian officials and free black residents pressured British authorities to grant freedom to all enslaved passengers. Despite American protests and demands for their return as property, the British government granted asylum to the formerly enslaved individuals, arguing that British law prohibited slavery in its territories. Only the 19 directly involved in the rebellion were held for trial, and they were eventually released. The Creole case created a significant diplomatic crisis between the United States and Britain, with the American government demanding compensation for the loss of human property. It established important precedents regarding maritime law, asylum rights, and the limits of slaveholding power beyond American territorial waters, the Malay Uprising. The Malay Uprising is an urban slave rebellion that occurred in Salvador, Bahia, Brazil, during the early morning hours of January 25, 1835. It was organized by Malay, a term for Muslim African slaves and freedmen, predominantly Yoruba and Hausa people, who maintained their Islamic faith despite forced conversion attempts. The rebellion was carefully planned to coincide with Ramadan and the Catholic feast of Our Lady of Guidance, when authorities would be less vigilant. Approximately 600 rebels, wearing white garments and Islamic amulets, gathered with the intention of seizing control of Salvador, freeing enslaved people, and killing whites and mulattoes. The plot was betrayed hours before execution, allowing authorities to prepare defenses. The resulting street battles lasted approximately 3 hours, resulting in the deaths of over 70 rebels and 9 soldiers or civilians. Authorities responded with brutal repression, executing 4 leaders, sentencing others to death, prison, or deportation to Africa, and destroying Islamic texts and religious materials. The Malay Uprising revealed the existence of sophisticated resistance networks among enslaved populations in the Americas, demonstrating high levels of literacy in Arabic, organized religious communities, and sustained cultural identity despite enslavement. It influenced Brazilian slave codes and intensified surveillance of African cultural and religious practices throughout the country. The Berbice Slave Uprising. The Berbice Slave Uprising is a major rebellion that occurred in the Dutch colony of Berbice, located in present-day Guyana, beginning on February 23, 1763. It was led by Cuffy, also spelled Kofi, an enslaved man who organized a coordinated revolt across multiple plantations along the Berbice River. The rebellion involved approximately 3,000 enslaved people who seized control of most of the colony within weeks. Dutch colonists fled to coastal areas or the capital, Fort Nassau, while rebels burned plantations and killed approximately 100 whites. Cuffy established a functioning government, appointed officers, and attempted diplomatic negotiations with Dutch Governor Simon van Hoogenheim, proposing to divide the colony between free Africans and Dutch settlers. The governor refused, stalling while requesting military assistance from neighboring colonies. Reinforcements arrived from French Martinique and British Barbados. Months later, internal divisions emerged among the rebels between those favoring negotiation and those demanding complete control. Cuffy reportedly died by suicide in May 1763, after losing a power struggle with more militant faction leaders. Dutch forces gradually regained control through military campaigns that lasted until 1764. Cuffy is now considered a national hero in Guyana, where his image appears on currency and monuments commemorate his resistance against colonial oppression. Fiden's Rebellion. Fiden's Rebellion is a mixed-race revolution that occurred in Grenada from March 1795 to June 1796. It was led by Julien Fiden, a free-colored planter of mixed French and African descent who owned a successful cocoa and coffee estate. Fiden was inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution and the ongoing Haitian Revolution, particularly the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. When British forces captured Grenada from France in 1763, French planters and free people of color faced discrimination under British rule. Fiden organized a rebellion that united enslaved people, free-colored individuals, and some French planters against British colonial authorities. The uprising began on March 2, 1795, with coordinated attacks across the island. Rebels captured Grenville, the capital, and killed British Governor Ninian Home during the fighting. Fiden established control over most of Grenada, holding the mountainous interior for over a year, while British forces controlled only the coastal areas. The rebellion involved guerrilla warfare tactics, with rebels using knowledge of local terrain to resist British military campaigns. British reinforcements eventually overwhelmed the rebels. In June 1796, Fiden disappeared after the rebellion's collapse, with his fate remaining unknown. The uprising resulted in approximately 7,000 deaths and reshaped Caribbean colonial politics by demonstrating the revolutionary potential of alliances between free people of color and enslaved populations. Busa's Rebellion. Busa's Rebellion is a coordinated slave uprising that occurred in Barbados beginning on Easter Sunday, April 14, 1816. It was led by Busa, an enslaved African-born man who worked as a ranger, a position that allowed him greater mobility and contact with enslaved people across multiple plantations. The rebellion was partly triggered by misconceptions among enslaved people that the British Parliament had passed emancipation legislation, but local planters were refusing to implement it. This misunderstanding stemmed from parliamentary debates about ameliorating slave conditions and registering enslaved populations. Busa organized a network of conspirators across several parishes, planning to seize control of the island and establish a government led by enslaved people. The uprising began with the burning of cane fields as a signal, spreading rapidly across approximately 70 plantations. Thousands of enslaved people participated, destroying property and engaging in armed conflict with militia forces. British military forces and militia units brutally suppressed the rebellion within 3 days. Approximately 400 enslaved people were killed in battle or executed afterward, including Busa, who died fighting. Approximately 144 rebels were executed after trials. Busa's rebellion influenced the abolitionist movement in Britain by demonstrating that enslaved people would continue resisting until freedom was granted, making abolition appear inevitable and economically necessary. The Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution is the only successful slave rebellion that resulted in the establishment of an independent nation. It occurred in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, from August 1791 to January 1804. The revolution began when enslaved people in the northern province launched a coordinated uprising, burning hundreds of sugar and coffee plantations and killing approximately 1,000 white colonists. The rebellion was led initially by Duddy Boukman, a Vodou priest, and later by Toussaint Louverture, a formerly enslaved man who became a brilliant military strategist and political leader. The conflict evolved into a complex 13-year war involving shifting alliances and conflicts with French, Spanish, and British forces, all attempting to control the profitable colony. Toussaint negotiated with various powers, sometimes allying with Spain against France, then with France against Britain. While consistently advancing the cause of freedom for enslaved people, he established control over the entire island by 1801 and created a constitution that effectively made Saint-Domingue autonomous. Napoleon Bonaparte sent an expedition to restore French authority and slavery in 1802. Toussaint was captured through deception and died in a French prison in 1803. Jean-Jacques Dessalines continued the resistance, defeating French forces and declaring Haiti's independence on January 1, 1804. The Haitian Revolution terrified slaveholding powers worldwide and inspired resistance movements throughout the Americas. Aponte's Rebellion. Aponte's Rebellion is a conspiracy and attempted uprising that occurred in Cuba in 1812. It was organized by José Antonio Aponte, a free black carpenter, sculptor, and former militia officer living in Havana. Aponte created an extensive network linking free people of color and enslaved people across Havana with those on sugar plantations throughout western Cuba. He maintained a book filled with drawings depicting black kings, military victories, and the Haitian Revolution, which he used to inspire potential conspirators by demonstrating the possibility of successful black resistance and self-governance. The conspiracy planned to coordinate simultaneous uprisings across multiple locations, targeting sugar estates and military installations. Smaller uprisings occurred on several plantations. In March 1812, but authorities discovered the larger conspiracy before it could be fully implemented. Spanish colonial authorities arrested Aponte and other leaders, conducting trials that relied on testimony extracted through torture. Aponte was executed by hanging on April 9, 1812, and his head was displayed publicly as a warning. 8 other conspirators were also executed. Spanish authorities systematically suppressed historical documentation about the rebellion, destroying records and limiting discussion to prevent it from inspiring future resistance. Despite this suppression, Aponte's Rebellion represented one of the most sophisticated and widespread conspiracies in Cuban colonial history, demonstrating the organizational capabilities of free and enslaved black communities. The Demerara Rebellion. The Demerara Rebellion is a major slave uprising that occurred in the British colony of Demerara, present-day Guyana, beginning on August 18, 1823. It was organized by Quamina, an enslaved man who served as a deacon in a Christian chapel, and his son Jack Gladstone, who worked as a cooper. The rebellion involved between 10,000 and 13,000 enslaved people across approximately 60 plantations along the eastern coast of Demerara. The rebels planned to seize control peacefully, intending to hold planters hostage until the British government granted them freedom and better working conditions. They believed rumors that the British Crown had already emancipated them, but colonial authorities were withholding the decree. The uprising began with the ringing of chapel bells as a signal, and rebels quickly took control of most plantations in the affected region. Contrary to their leaders' instructions to avoid violence, some groups killed 2 white men during the initial phase. British Governor John Murray declared martial law and mobilized military forces, including artillery. The rebellion was suppressed within 2 days, though scattered resistance continued for weeks. Approximately 250 enslaved people were killed during the fighting or executed afterward. Quamina was killed while trying to escape, and Jack Gladstone was sentenced to death but later transported. John Smith, a white missionary wrongly accused of inciting the rebellion, died in prison awaiting execution, becoming a martyr for the abolitionist cause in Britain.